He may try in 5 or 7 years if we fail to make the necessary investments. Those were the words of NATO chief Mark Rutte when asked if Russia was planning to invade Estonia. His warning is clear. The Baltic state is on Russian President Vladimir Putin's agenda, and we may see a repeat of Ukraine in the early 2030s. Estonia won't take that invasion lying down. The country hears Rutte's warning and is preparing for a full-scale war against Russia. The question now is whether Estonia is capable of fending off Putin's forces or if it would collapse under Russian pressure if Putin invades. On July 5th, current NATO head Mark Rutte sat down for an interview with the New York Times, speaking in Brussels in the wake of a massive NATO summit in which he pledged that NATO would set up a new target for its members of spending 5% of their gross domestic product, or GDP, on their militaries by 2035. Rutte clearly had future Russian aggression on his mind. Aggression that may soon focus on Estonia. The Baltic state was recently the subject of an article in The New Yorker, which focused on a massive military exercise being conducted in the country. That same article pointed out some major problems Estonia may face in the future, noting that the country had no air force or navy to repel a future Russian invasion. Rutte was quizzed about his thoughts on the situation, and he was quick to warn Putin away from Estonia. No, what the New Yorker described there is right, but it's not a wake-up call, because we have all the plans in place that if Estonia will be attacked, and the Russians know this, our reaction will be devastating, Rutte told the New York Times. As for what that reaction might entail, Rutte chose not to go into any specific details. I cannot go into all the details because Vladimir Putin, I know, is watching these programs, but we have to make sure that we not only have those plans, but that we also have the people and the military gear to back it up, Rutte said. However, he did reveal that any plans to defend Estonia would see the United States play a key role. And this is exactly why we need to spend more. But it's not that the Estonians are left to themselves. It will be the full force of NATO, including the full backup of the United States, which will come to the rescue, Rutte added. So that's good news for Estonia, right? Not necessarily. While Rutte warned that Putin knows he faces the full fury of NATO if he invades Estonia, that force needs to become what Estonia needs it to be. Otherwise, Putin's invasion will come sooner rather than later. This is why he will not attack Estonia today, Rutte added when speaking about NATO. But he might in 5 or 7 years if we would not make all these extra investments. The message is clear. NATO needs to spend big now, or Estonia is next on Putin's list. Rutte's words aren't anything new to Estonia. The country had been warning of Putin's aggression for months before the NATO chief acknowledged the problem. Back in February, Reuters reported on comments made by Kaupo Rosin, who is the chief of Estonia's foreign intelligence service. Rutte's more recent comments are merely echoes of what Rosin said months ago. Russia has chosen a path which is a long-term confrontation, and the Kremlin is probably anticipating a possible conflict with NATO within the next decade or so, Rosin said at the time. And like Rutte, Rosin knows that preparation is the key to dealing with Putin's ambitions. If we are not prepared, the likelihood of a military Russian attack will be much higher than without any preparation, the intelligence chief added. What we have here are warnings, 2 of them. One from a key figure in Estonia's intelligence service and another from the head of NATO itself, both of whom are saying that Putin wants to pick a fight with NATO and he's going to use Estonia as the launching point for his future war. But that only brings us to some questions. Why does Russia want to invade Estonia? How is Estonia preparing for a fight with Putin, and is it really ready to win that war if it does start in the next 5 to 7 years? We'll start with why. And as with so many things when it comes down to Putin, it all comes down to history. Estonia has a long history of finding itself under foreign rule. At various points during its history, it's been occupied and controlled by Germany, Sweden, and Russia, the latter of which laid claim to the country for decades until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. It was in that same year that Estonia declared its independence in the wake of the August coup in Moscow. Finally, after so long under Russian rule, Estonia was a sovereign nation. Putin thinks it shouldn't be. And evidence of that comes from the strange interview US pundit Tucker Carlson held with Putin in February 2024. Putin didn't mention Estonia by name in that interview. He didn't have to. Instead, Putin offered long and rambling justifications for his invasion of Ukraine that hinted at why Estonia and countries like it are on his radar. That's according to the Atlantic Council, which noted that much of Carlson's interview with Putin turned into a pseudo-history lesson from Russia's president. After sidestepping Carlson's initial question, the council says, Putin launched into a rambling half-hour lecture covering more than 1,000 years of Russian and Ukrainian history that placed the roots of today's war firmly in the distant past. His core message was chillingly simple. Ukraine has no right to exist, and he is fully justified in waging a war of aggression to reclaim historically Russian lands. The diatribe essentially amounted to Putin claiming that Russia's conquests of the past should hold true today. It's a similar message to one Russia's leader delivered in the summer of 2022, mere months after he launched his Ukraine invasion, in which he compared himself to Russia's former Tsar, Peter the Great. Peter the Great waged the Great Northern War for 21 years. It would seem that he was at war with Sweden. He took something from them. He did not take anything from them. He returned what was Russia's, The Guardian reported Putin as saying at the time. Apparently, it's also our lot to return what is Russia's and strengthen the country, and if we proceed from the fact that these basic values form the basis of our existence, we will certainly succeed in solving the task that we face. That brings us back to Estonia. Though Putin provided all of these justifications in the context of his Ukraine invasion, there are plenty of parallels between the Russian president's current target and the one Rutte warns he may attack in 5 to 7 years. Putin's comparison of himself to Peter the Great is important here. After all, it was that very Tsar who ended Sweden's former control over Estonia during the Second Northern War, according to Encyclopedia Britannica. In doing so, the encyclopedia says Peter was able to achieve the dream of several Tsars who came before him as he took control over the Baltic states. By 1721, Sweden had ceded all of its control over these states, which included Estonia, to Russia. Therein lies Putin's desire to take Estonia. Many misinterpret Putin's current expansionism as a desire to rebuild the Soviet Union. That isn't the case. As the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace points out, Putin is actually anti-Soviet. It says that Russia's president views Vladimir Lenin as a destructive and subversive force who ruined the version of Russia that Putin aspires to recreate, the version that was at its most prominent under Peter the Great, the glorious Russian Empire of old that included Estonia, the rest of the Baltics, Ukraine, and many other states that are now sovereign and independent of Russia. More parallels come from the presence of Russian language speakers inside Estonia. In March, the BBC noted that Russia has been pressing against Estonia's border using hybrid warfare attacks. Of particular focus for Putin is the city of Narva, which the outlet says contains a large ethnic Russian community, to the point where more than 90% of the population speaks Russian as its native tongue. Many of the city's residents have dual citizenship between Estonia and Russia, the BBC adds. Again, we see the parallels. There's a reason why the likes of Donetsk and Luhansk, along with Crimea back in 2024, are such key targets for Putin. Those regions also contain plenty of people who trace their histories back to Russia itself, with both Donetsk and Luhansk even having puppet governments led by pro-Russian politicians who are under Putin's thumb. All of this only adds to the historical arguments that Putin makes, no matter how twisted those arguments may be. Russia's leader will dive back for centuries to justify his modern-day expansionism, using the presence of Russian natives in the nations he targets to further prove his supposed point. That's what he did with Ukraine. Estonia will be no different, and the Baltic nation knows it. This doesn't mean that NATO has nothing to do with Putin's reasoning. Estonia would still serve as the launching point for a wider war against the collective defense organization if Putin chooses to invade. However, Estonia's history can't be ignored. Putin will inevitably point to it, just as he did with Ukraine, to explain his actions. All of this means that Estonia needs to prepare for a war with Russia, potentially in the next 5 years. That's precisely what it's doing, which brings us back to the second question we posed earlier in the video. How is Estonia getting ready for a fight against Russia? Landmines are one of the answers, a lot of them. On July 6th, Euromaidan Press reported that Russia had recently accused the tiny Baltic nation of trying to turn itself into a nuclear threat after Estonia expressed a willingness to allow NATO to host stealth aircraft on its territory. Estonia likely predicted this reaction. That's why it spent the last few months fortifying its 210-mile border with Russia as best it can, especially the previously mentioned city of Narva. Border infrastructure is planned to be built on the land border, the southeastern border, over a total of 115 kilometers. Part of that border is on water bodies, and no infrastructure will be built there because the water body itself acts as a natural barrier. Most of the southeastern border is located in difficult terrain and forested areas. The city of Narva is well within range of Russia's artillery, Euromaidan Press points out, meaning it will be a strong candidate to serve as Putin's starting point for an invasion of Estonia. Landmines are key to the border defense Estonia is creating, Euromaidan Press highlights. It reports that Estonia, along with the other Baltic states of Latvia and Lithuania, as well as Poland and Finland, is attempting to create a modern-day Iron Curtain. During the Soviet era, the term Iron Curtain was used to denote both the physical and philosophical division of Europe into East and West, the former of which was under heavy Russian influence. Today's Iron Curtain is different. Estonia, along with the other nations we mentioned, have all left the Ottawa Treaty, which bans the use of anti-personnel landmines. They've done so seemingly for the express purpose of being able to lace their borders with these mines in preparation for a future Russian invasion. That's precisely what Estonia is doing right now. Beyond laying landmines, Euromaidan Press says Estonia has invested around $6.1 million into border defenses in and around Narva. Those defenses include the construction of 32 bunkers near the city, along with the creation of 12 ammunition depots and anti-tank barriers designed to slow down a Russian ground assault. Odessa Journal adds to this, noting in June that Estonia has already built about 2.4 miles of anti-tank ditches and is hard at work building many more along its borders. Dragon's Teeth, which are more anti-tank measures, are also being erected along the border between Estonia and Russia, EER reports. Lieutenant Colonel Einar Afanasiev, who commands the engineering unit of the Estonian Defence Forces, leaves no room for doubt about why Estonia is doing all of this. An anti-tank ditch halts the enemy and slows down their advance, he says. When they try to create a passage through it, they become an easy target for our weapons. It's clear who they refers to: Russia. Estonia isn't making any attempt to hide what it's doing along the border from Russia. And that's the point. All of these defenses are being erected in full view of Putin because Estonia is trying to send a message: invade our country at your peril. To reinforce that message, Estonia is conducting military drills to ensure its troops, along with its NATO allies, are ready for the invasion that Rutte says may be coming. In May, Estonia hosted a massive military exercise named Hedgehog 25. UNN reports the exercise involved 16,000 soldiers from 10 NATO countries, who took part in a 3-week simulation that saw mock Russian troops launch an invasion across the border. That's about as on the nose as such an exercise can get, and it allowed Estonia, along with NATO, to test what it calls the stretch approach to dealing with a Russian invasion. Under this approach, Baltic forces stationed in Estonia would delay a Russian offensive as the rest of NATO prepares to come to Estonia's aid. The idea is to ensure Russia doesn't advance into Estonia itself, or at least not far enough into the country to take any substantial amounts of territory before NATO can organize a full response. The exercise was comprehensive. Estonia tested a new network of 120 sirens, which combined to form the country's emergency alert system. Those sirens were installed soon after Putin invaded Ukraine, showing us that war with Russia had been on the collective Estonian mind for a long time. Euractiv reports that those sirens also serve as a cue for the F-16s stationed in Estonia. Those US-made fighter jets will be in the skies and patrolling Estonia's border within 15 minutes of the sirens going off, which is another capability Hedgehog 25 was designed to test. Peter Kuimet, who's the Estonian Defence Ministry's Director of International Cooperation, says that the exercise was a landmark military event. The exercise is the first time we are actually rehearsing NATO's new regional deterrence and defence plans, including the swift redeployment of international units in the defence of Estonia, Kuimet said. He also drew parallels between Estonia and Ukraine, adding, "In Bucha, we saw how the Russians treat the Ukrainians, their Slavic brothers. I don't want to think about how they would treat the Balts, whom they have always considered evil fascists." Again, we see that Estonia isn't trying to hide the fact that it's preparing for Russia. It's sending the message that it's getting ready as loud and clear as it can to Putin. And it's not just the large-scale military operations like these that send the message. Estonia is getting ready for a fight on a city-wide level, as we can see in the city of Narva. In April, France 24 reported on the conflicting attitudes in Narva. In a video, it highlighted that some in the city yearn for a return to the days of Russian rule, with one resident stating, "It's wonderful, what can I say? Russia is magnificent." He was speaking at a special event held just across the border designed to commemorate Victory Day, which is Russia's annual celebration of its victory over the Nazis during World War II. But even as some Narva citizens celebrate Russia, the city is preparing for a fight. Banners have been erected decrying Putin as a war criminal. Estonian police patrol the bridge that serves as a border crossing between Russia and Estonia, including the 200 people who cross per day. That bridge is loaded with barbed wire and dragon's teeth, and there's a clear tension from both sides. When France 24 attempted to film the Russian side from the Estonian side, Russia's border forces retreated out of view. Russia has made threats across that border in the past. It's removed buoys in the waters that mark the separation between Estonia and Russia. Sometimes, Russia's threats become even more dangerous, as Director General of the Estonian Police and Border Guard, Egert Belitsev, points out. There have been balloons with jamming equipment in order to surveil our technology. There are constant jamming of GPS signals, he says. Russia's hybrid war is clearly underway. Close to the border, France 24 says, Estonia is training civilians to fight, perhaps believing that they will serve as Narva's first line of defense. They are all part of the Estonia Defense League, and unlike some of Narva's citizens, they want to be ready to repel Russia if Putin invades. Finally, there's Estonia's defense spending. Estonia isn't a large nation. In 2024, Statista says the country's GDP was around $42.75 billion, though it's projected to increase to a little over $57 billion by 2030. Still, even with that relatively small GDP, Estonia is committing to spending as much as it can on its defense. In April, Estonia's government approved plans to increase the country's defense spending to 5.4% of its GDP, marking Estonia as one of the first NATO members to break the 5% barrier. It's well in advance of Rutte's goal to have every nation spending that much by 2035. Again, Russia is the reason why. Estonia is preparing for a fight with Russia. But is that a fight Estonia can win? On its own, the tiny Baltic nation doesn't stand a chance. Even after After more than 3 years of attritional war in Ukraine, Russia has more than 100 times the number of people who are fit for military service and an active military of 1.32 million compared to Estonia's 7,700. Estonia only has 5 aircraft in its military. Russia has almost 4,300. Estonia has no tanks and over 129,000 fewer armored vehicles than Russia. And when it comes to naval strength, Estonia's tiny fleet of 8 patrol vessels can't do anything against a Russian navy that has 419 assets. However, that's not the point. Estonia knows that it can't defeat Russia in a one-on-one fight. Every preparation it's making right now is in service of delaying Russia for as long as possible once NATO's Article 5 is triggered. That article lies at the heart of NATO's collective defense philosophy. It states that every NATO member is duty-bound to come to any single member's aid if that nation is attacked. Estonia, as a NATO member, only needs to be able to hold out for as long as it takes NATO to respond to a Russian invasion. And when that response comes, it drastically changes the game. Collectively, NATO is stronger than Russia in many departments. Statista points out that NATO has over 8.6 million military personnel compared to Russia's total of 3.57 million, when counting active soldiers, reserves, and paramilitary forces. The collective NATO Air Force is over 4 times the size of Russia's Air Force, and NATO's naval assets number 1,143. On the ground, NATO has 11,495 main battle tanks compared to Russia's ever-depleting stocks, 5,750, along with around 9 times the number of armored vehicles. Of course, Russia neither nor NATO would dedicate their entire forces to a war in Estonia, at least not initially. Plus, the strength of NATO's response hinges on whether the US would get involved or leave NATO's European members to help Estonia. Nevertheless, the plan is clear. Estonia will serve as NATO's first line of defense against Putin's forces, and it's preparing to do just that. The key now is that NATO, as a collective, needs to be ready to reinforce that first line if Russia does invade in the next 5 to 7 years. It should be ready. Many of its members are making the right moves, at least in terms of their defense spending. However, Putin may still want to take the risk, especially if he believes that there are divisions in NATO. Regardless, one thing is for certain: Estonia is prepared for a fight. But if Ukraine keeps on fighting as hard as it is, Estonia may not even have to worry about Putin. Ukraine has just killed a top Russian Navy commander who'd only been in the job for a handful of months. Find out more and what this means for Russia in our video.